Welcome to Influence to Death, your guide for navigating the wild world of wellness influencing.
Hello and welcome to the Influence to Death podcast. I am your co-host, Hannah Wright.
And I am your co-host, Victoria Lafont. And today we are here with Dr. Sara Russell. And Hannah and I have been messaging back and forth like we cannot wait for this episode. It's a little bit different than the format that we usually have with our episodes, but Sara's work is so important that we want to feature her on the podcast. So Sara, we have a little bit of it's turning into a tradition where people don't want their bios read on the podcast.
Okay.
I will totally read your bio if you want me to.
It's okay. I would feel like a total outcast, but yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it's sort of turning into this like trend.
No. I know, I listened to all the episodes. So.
Oh, awesome. Thank you.
Tradition. Yeah.
But I do want to say a little bit about you just because I want people to understand the impact of your mind and how you put your mind out into the world. So I've had the pleasure of working with Sara, studying near her, working closely with her for years. Now I'm trying to think like how many years. Like we've definitely been in the same circles for close to a decade.
Yeah.
And then working closely together for 5 years. And for the content of this podcast, the part of her work that we're going to focus on is the accurate interpretation of blood tests in preconception, pregnancy, and postpartum. But Sara, your work goes so beyond that. Like how I would describe you is first empathetic with the clients that you see as a nutritionist, but also incredibly investigative. So I know if like I still have people that contact me and they want referrals out, from when I was a clinician. And if there's any sort of like question about, what's the root cause or it's been this medical mystery or like that, I just send them straight to your website. And so your main points of focus have been fertility and preconception, pregnancy, postpartum in that world, but also all types of connective tissue disorders, hypermobility, ASDs, so like autism spectrum disorders, neurodivergence, and basically just helping people live in the way that's best for them. I wouldn't even use the word like optimal for you because I feel like your ethos is so like encompassing. Optimal feels like kind of outside of what you might want to lead people to from an emotional and sort of like heart-centered spot. Yeah, your work is just like, it's very beautiful and it's incredibly helpful for people who have complex issues. But then specific for today, what we'll focus on is that point of our blood changes when we get pregnant. And those specifics are incredibly important. And you have done an immense amount of research in that realm that we want to talk to people about. So I'm saying it's a little bit different than most of our podcasts because people are probably used to kind of like the history, bias, research, takeaway, sort of 4-part format that we follow. We're going to touch on those points today, but really we just want to feature Sara's work.
Well, thank you so much, first of all, for having me. I'm really excited. I love your podcast.
Oh, yay.
Yeah. I was so excited to listen to that episode with Amanda. I was just listening to that this morning. Very sweet.
Yeah, our detox episode. There's a part 2 coming. So
yeah, I know. I'm excited about that too.
Been doing my deep breathing to get ready.
Such a great topic. Yeah. So I'm super excited to be here and talking with the two of you and with your audience, because this is a topic that really excites me a lot. And I feel like it's an area of activism in a way, because I mean, it might sound like a technical skill. Okay, learn to correctly interpret the blood work of pregnant women and women who have just given birth and understand what labs couples should order before they conceive. I mean, it sounds very technical, right? But it is activism, because when you get used to the fact, and I just learned this clinically by experience, because clients would come to me during pregnancy with their lab work, and so many things were just off. And I was like, that she can't have an infection. That she doesn't have any symptoms of it. Why are her white blood cells so high? And I started just looking on PubMed to understand if and how these ranges change during pregnancy, and just marker by marker as things would come back flagged or didn't compute with what I was seeing clinically and knew about the client's history. I would just research that, and I started compiling notes, and it got to be very tortuous. I was also using the Teats book of clinical chemistry in addition to, researching on PubMed.
Which is
But
like a textbook,
it
essentially.
is. It's a huge textbook. Such a big textbook that when I moved to Italy from the US, I couldn't bring it with me in my first round. I had to leave it with my friend Dave. I was like, hit it as much as you want. I will come back for it. And I did.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's maybe cool for listeners to know if they aren't watching the video. Sarah is in rural northern Italy right now and has lived there on a homestead for how many years now? Have you been there?
I have been in Italy for 10 years now, living in a little homestead on the Tuscan countryside. I am actually uh, also living in a camper in Florence every other weekend. It's
Oh,
a whole
cool,
other
Sarah.
story.
That's awesome.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's also important maybe just to say to people if they don't have a context for blood chemistry or blood test interpretation, like what we mean when we say that is when you go to the doctor, sometimes you get blood tests run. People are fairly familiar with that. There's
Mhm.
been an enormous movement in the world of integrative medicine and specifically, it's called like functional medicine, functional blood testing, where blood tests are interpreted in a certain way. That's actually kind of this whole other interesting conversation. But so, what Sarah specifically is doing is looking at the lab work, the blood tests of, like you're saying, couples before they conceive or women when they are pregnant by trimester, which I know you're going to get into that,
Mhm.
and then postpartum and what the big differences are. And like you're saying, you were seeing all of these markers being way off and trying to
Mhm.
figure out kind of what was going on based on what you saw in front of you. And I mean, do you just want to speak a little bit more about that? Like how many markers you would see consistently being off, kind of what the scope of that
Yeah.
discrepancy was?
So, how many markers would be off would really depend on what the client's doctor would run in terms of their
Mm-hmm.
lab work. But some of the most common markers to run are the complete blood count with differential, as well as what else was I seeing coming back flagged early on? That, and sometimes, some of the iron markers when those were being run. Some of the stuff is just not, some of it is just an insufficient running of markers. So,
Mm-hmm.
some clinicians are just not running enough markers to even begin to give us an understanding of what a person's actual iron status is. So that's another story. But, so part of the issue was what are we not looking at that we should be looking at? And
Mm-hmm.
then the second is why in even a one-page basic lab report of these blood chemistry markers that are coming back, like even kidney stuff,
Right.
one notices that GFR goes, way up during pregnancy. And I was like, oh, is that normal? Like,
Mm-hmm.
or is it just, obviously it wasn't being flagged as being off. I just noticed that the numbers were higher.
Mm-hmm.
And so, of course, one of the questions is why, why does this lab work look so different?
Right.
And then, of course, even backing up to preconception, what are the labs that we should be looking at that maybe physicians are not counseling their patients to run? That
Mm-hmm.
might make a difference, especially when couples are struggling to conceive or have a
Mm-hmm.
history of miscarriage. So it's not so much that the lab ranges are different, except, thyroid, we want to make sure that we're looking at ranges that are actually functionally appropriate for fertility, which are not the same ranges that you would see on a standard lab report. But other than that, there really aren't differences compared to how we would interpret the results. It's just more an issue of what are we wanting to see and why are we wanting to see that? How can that help people become as fertile as they need to be in order to conceive a pregnancy and to bring that to term in a healthful way and have a healthy baby?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there's kind of two parts I think that we might kind of dive into in this episode. One is preconception, well, three parts. One is preconception, then one is pregnancy, and then one is postpartum. And it's like a little bit of a different story for
Mhm.
each area. Hannah, did you well, you kind of had a surprise pregnancy, right?
Yeah, I had a surprise pregnancy. So I was not prepared or I didn't plan. It definitely stressed me out initially because I'm very much like skewing towards a type A personality. So I was like, I'm going to have this pregnancy. It's going to be perfect. I'm going to eat like so great and get ready for it. And then, and then I was like, oh shit, I'm not prepared for this. And then I had, really bad morning sickness and everything. But other than that, I had a healthy pregnancy and didn't have any hypertension or any other things that popped up. But also I was interested to learn because I have MTHFR. I'm a homozygous for C677T. So
Mm-hmm.
my homocysteine used to be on the high side. And when I
Mhm.
figured it out, I started taking methylfolate and that
Sure.
fixed it and fixed actually a lot of other symptoms I
Yeah.
had. that I wasn't aware that were connected.
Sure.
And so going into it, the only person that noticed that, because I had told, it was on my record because I had let my physician know that previously so that I could get insurance to cover the homocysteine blood test.
Yeah.
Nice.
And so the only person that noticed was my ultrasound technician. And she said that she used to work in a high risk pregnancy clinic. And she brought it up. She was like, by the way, I've seen so many healthy pregnancies with women who have, MTHFR homozygous. And I was like, oh, thank you for saying that,
Yeah.
but no one else mentioned it. And I actually had to explain to them why I was taking a specific prenatal with methylated folate
Yeah.
and the other like co-nutrients because no
Yeah.
one understood. They didn't know why. Yeah, and I was kind of shocked because I thought this is probably something that should be pretty standard and it's not.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
And it's a
Yeah,
big deal. I
absolutely.
mean, Sarah, do you want to speak a little bit about like the importance of I don't even know really the right biological way to say it. Like women know by and large, like you need to take folic acid. This is
Mhm.
we're getting into a different
yeah, sorry to
discussion,
open a can of worms.
but it is kind
No,
of it's important
it's
because
a really important can of worms, and it is. This
yeah.
is where we could really overlap with the influencer topic, right?
Mhm.
Mm,
Because we have on the one hand and bias, right? So on the one hand, we have the allopathic world that is sort of saying, folic acid, it doesn't matter what form, like like when they say folic acid on a blood test, that actually means folate in any form whatsoever. It's not differentiated. But there are a lot of people who just can't really metabolize folic acid properly. And that is the form that is used as an additive in certain foods, like,
Delicious cereal.
yeah,
yeah.
I love cereal.
yeah, like a lot of things that say fortified are,
Yeah.
so if you look at the ingredients, you will see that folic acid is the form used. But a lot of most prenatal vitamins have folic acid, most multivitamins have folic acid. And then there are other forms that are active. Some, you mentioned methylated folate, Hannah. Some people are taking active forms that are not methylated because maybe they're even sensitive to overmethylation. I
Right.
am an overmethylator, and oh my goodness, I took methylprednisone once, and I don't think anybody who saw me that day will ever forget.
But that's a really
Watch
important. I
out!
mean, it's funny, but it's an important point because I think we
Yeah,
have like the conventional world that's like folic acid, same, whatever. It's all it works. And then in
yeah,
the functional world, we're like, I think the functional sort of like party line is like it has to be methylated. But the reality is that people are very different. Some people can. And Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong. Some people can very efficiently use folic acid, and
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
it has absolutely decreased the incidences of midline
for sure.
deficiencies,
Yeah,
in fortification. But then with methylfolate, there can be, like you're saying, over methylators where they do
yeah,
not need that methyl group, that it's
yeah,
actually problematic for them. And
sure.
so there's all shades in between.
Yeah,
And we just kind of pick the, hill that we're going to die on, like folic acid
for
or
sure.
methylfolate. And it's like, hang on.
Well, it's not either or, because there's also this form called calcium folinate, which is also called folinic acid. It has that
Mm-hmm.
extra syllable, and it's an important one. And that is a nice active form that is very middle of the road. It doesn't,
Right.
it's active, but it's not methylated. So it's the form that I will often preferentially use with people where, where we're not sure if they're over methylated. I really feel more comfortable not recommending folic acid in my practice, but I completely understand how on a large, because I work with people who have complex health issues, and many of those people just don't metabolize these forms as well.
Mm-hmm.
But in large populations, folic acid has definitely had beneficial effects, both in terms of its use in multivitamins and prenatals and in terms of food fortifications. Folic acid has definitely had benefits, just like, fortifying table salt with iodine has large scale benefits. And what happens on the non-allopathic side, when I was referring to the influencer trends in this area, is there's a huge trend right now that has been going on for a few years where people are being advised by these influencers not to take prenatal vitamins before conception and during pregnancy. And it makes me so angry
Can't you
because
just take liver as a prenatal, Sarah?
you can,
Oh, can we talk about that? It
yeah,
makes me so angry too.
Yeah.
So let me
Liver is not
contextualize this for
a
people though. So
prenatal.
we're really talking, let's talk
Yeah.
preconception now, and then we'll
Yeah.
move into pregnancy and postpartum. And I just want to make sure this is clear because it's great to have a little
Yeah.
conversation, but just to like ground people a little bit. Sarah has gathered, this, like I said, it's an immense deep dive, all this information, and created a course. So, like, all of this has been systemized in this course. So, we're like talking through all of this research that she's done. I like hope we can get it all done, in about an hour. But if not, please come on again if you have time and we can keep
Okay.
talking. But let's start with preconception, then we'll go to pregnancy and then to postpartum. So, yeah, preconception, go.
Yeah.
Can you
And
take liver as a prenatal?
yes, you cannot take liver. I mean, you can take liver, just don't consider it to be a substitute for the prenatal. Liver per se, some people love it, some people hate it. I actually do not like the idea of people taking it in capsules. I believe you should taste your liver. And if you don't like it, you shouldn't eat it. I really feel the same way about that with children. Liver, oysters, whatever. I mean, I do sometimes suggest to people that they take the Oyster Max supplements that are basically dehydrated
Yeah.
oysters.
Yeah.
Obviously not in place of a multi or a prenatal or whatnot, but they do have some validity. Like, I wouldn't want somebody to be over relying on something like that they're just not tasting. You can sort of taste it through the capsule actually, but
Yeah.
like if you hold a food in your mouth and you taste it and you have a strong aversion to it, like beef liver, I wanted beef liver all the time after I gave birth. Beef liver, boar's liver, pork liver, bring it on. But in normal life, I love chicken liver and I find beef liver to be way too strong. It has basically gram for gram, it has about 40 times more copper and it has substantially more iron. So it might be more minerals or, wrong mineral ratio for what some of us need. So by the time you're maybe getting close to even getting enough B vitamins to call it a supplement, you're probably overdosing on copper, which is not my first choice.
Yeah. And it's very common, if people
Yeah.
who listen are likely aware, but it is very common to see some people online say, like, instead of taking a prenatal, you can just replace it with a liver supplement. And normally that is followed by the statement, click here to get my liver.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's very big in the crunchy post prenatal, like,
Yeah.
nutritionists or health coaches.
Yeah.
And it gets a ton of engagement. People love it.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
this, yes, we don't need these supplements. Nature gave us this. And I'm all for nature. I mean, nature is an incredible healer.
Yeah.
Bountiful with what it get. Like, we get so much, but also like you said, things like copper. The copper in liver is so high, and so and then you're missing other nutrients, and the balance is all off, and
Yeah.
it's a very irresponsible recommendation, and
Yeah.
it makes me irate seeing it circulate on social media.
Oh yeah, me too. And unfortunately, some healthcare practitioners are also recommending skipping prenatals in favor of liver and or other organ supplements. So that happens, and I think it's really very irresponsible. So
Sarah, do you still have that prenatal guide on your website?
I do, yeah,
Look, this is a free guide that you can get from, is it sararusselntp.com?
Yeah.
Russell. It's not, you're not like affiliated with brands or like that. You're just like, hey, here are the like factors you need to pay attention to get a prenatal that is best for you. That guide is incredible. And you just go on your website and grab it. So if people are listening and they have questions like, well, shit, okay, I have been taking liver, or I was taking this prenatal with folic acid, and I'm not so sure, they can just go get that guide from your site and get a lot of information really quickly.
For sure. Or anybody who is taking a prenatal supplement and wants to know, is this, the right supplement for me to take right now? I mean, sometimes I'll even switch someone from preconception to, from somewhere between preconception and the second trimester, we'll switch to a different prenatal or add something in on the side, depending on what the person has going on, for sure.
But yeah, that natural user bias, I think that's what it's called. It's really strong in people. And I have that so strong where I wish that I could just like get rid of all of my belongings and my clothes and just go live on the land and like make my own shoes and eat, the plants and like that. And it's like, the reality is that we live on an earth that is so drastically different than when people were doing that. Combined with that was, if we were dropped into that world, in like a bubble, just to observe what people experienced when prenatals were not an option. Even in the most ideal settings, it was rough. And we
Oh
just
yeah,
don't think about that. We don't
Yeah.
think about mortality rates for infants and
oh
moms
yeah,
and birth defect. We just don't consider it. So
yeah. You know,
I
I studied medieval and Renaissance literature, culture, and law. Part of what I ran into in my research was, accounts. I still remember and reading this case in the law library in this Latin collection of medieval canon law written in 1140 by someone called Gratian, and it was a case about this woman with what was evidently postpartum psychosis who had killed her fairly recently born infant.
mhm.
So it was a hypothetical case, but most of his hypothetical cases were based on real scenarios that had occurred. And one of his questions was, is she legally responsible for what she did? Did she do it on purpose? Should her husband, ask for an annulment of their marriage? Should she be put in prison? What should we do? And essentially, he recognized that she had some kind of an imbalance because of her recent birth, and there was some kind of he didn't have the language for it, but he described what was evidently a situation where she was not in possession of her faculties. And she was not to be held
Wow.
legally or morally responsible for what she did. So people had, I looked at a lot of fiction and actual trial transcripts and whatnot. People had disabled children, people had cognitive problems, people had physical defects of all kinds. And then, people also had severe nutritional deficiencies. Many people had severe nutritional deficiencies, and that's obvious from a lot of what is described. So it was not the idyllic world that you might imagine that it was. I love nature just as much as you do. I live in the middle of the woods, basically in an old mill house by the river. And I still buy some things from the grocery store, like my coffee. And there are certain supplements I take, although I'm not planning to conceive or, I have not recently given birth. My youngest is 13.
It's also an interesting dovetail, just a cool fact about Sarah. She taught herself Latin to get her PhD when she was doing that research, which I remember learning that about you. And I was like, okay, you're one of those people that I'm just going to aspire to.
That's incredibly impressive.
Keep working in that direction. Maybe it'll happen this lifetime, maybe it won't. But I think it's important for our listeners to fully grasp you're not just fucking around. You've got a hell of a brain on your shoulders. So, and it's, I think to me, one of the reasons that I want to break the mold of our podcast and have you on is because people are used to getting their information from this shiny influencer vibe, and all of the bullet points are laid out, and here's the product, and here's the person, and it's ding, there's the shiny point on their dimple and that, and it's the reality is that sometimes that is backed by a lot of due diligence, and those two things absolutely can go together. And sometimes it's we live in a house by the river out in the woods, and we're not on social media as much, and there's still an incredible amount of brilliance there that people need to know about that will change their lives. So as much as we can amplify that, we want to.
Yes.
And just to break that idea in people's minds that that something that is popular is accurate and useful, because it does not always go together.
For sure.
So okay, so preconception, anything else? It's very important to take a prenatal that is accurate for you. But in the world of testing, which is kind of to get us a little back more on track, I know that it is individual. As a clinician, it's the words you say over and over that just drive people absolutely insane, where they're like, what about this? And you're like, well, it depends on your individual needs. But just generally, what would you recommend for people and couples as far as blood tests to run before they try to get pregnant?
Yeah. So, it's a good idea for both the male and the female partner to get tested for a complete blood count with differential.
Let me just tell people what that means real quick. So complete blood
Yeah.
count with the differentials, or you might see neutrophils, basophils, leukocytes, eosinophils. Differentials is just all the different types of white blood cells, but you can ask the clinician you're working with for the CBC with differentials.
So complete blood cell count without differential basically doesn't look at the subtypes of your white blood cells. It just gives you a total. but it still gives you all those red blood cell parameters. So it tells you all the stuff about, how big your red blood cells are and hemoglobin and all of these things. And that gives the practitioner a lot of information about, what all is going on inside at a cellular level, really. With the white blood cell differentials, you're looking at not just how many white blood cells you have, but also what the balance of your immune system is.
Mm-hmm.
And that's super helpful, and like a practitioner who is experienced in interpreting these things can understand if your immune system might be overloaded, if you could maybe, have a chronic infection or some kind of maybe a chronic inflammatory or maybe even autoimmune stressor. Obviously, we don't really want to overly chase every single little clue of possible dysfunction that there are some practitioners who just have so much anxiety and they create anxiety sometimes that is unnecessary. I'm talking about, really being diligent and taking in the context and the clinical picture.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm working with a couple that is struggling to conceive or maybe has had a history of miscarriage, I want to make sure that we're looking at their nutrient status, that we're looking at at least at the woman's full thyroid panel with antibodies, because insufficient levels of thyroid hormone and also elevated antibody activity can definitely influence the ability to get pregnant and stay pregnant. It can
And when you
also,
say antibody, correct me if I'm wrong, Sarah, but what she's referring to is that if there is a sign of our body's own immune system creating antibodies to the hormones that the thyroid creates or to the thyroid itself.
Mhm.
Yeah. So that's very important. That's not on most thyroid tests.
Yeah. Yeah. Most doctors will just order a TSH and a free T4. And that doesn't give us a lot of information. I mean, it's certainly better than nothing. But for somebody who's been struggling to get pregnant or has a history of miscarriage, that's significant. Also, somebody who maybe has a repeat pattern of miscarriage, one of the things that we want to look at is MTHFR. You mentioned that, Hannah. So that certainly could be, one part of the picture that could get looked at in a specific clinical situation. Also, just really, using common sense and looking at, lifestyle patterns and people's food journals. We can understand what, additional tests that might need to be run. So if I know that my client is vegan or vegetarian, then I will want to look at some additional markers. Also, very important to look at vitamin D status. And in both partners, I really like looking at retinol, which is vitamin A. It's very important for the proper function of eggs. So the corpus
Right.
luteum is it's called corpus luteum. Luteum actually means yellow and corpus means body. It's Latin. And the corpus luteum is not even luteum. It's not even yellow unless you have enough retinol, which is the active form of vitamin A. So I think it's really important. I mean, vitamin D and vitamin A are both immunomodulators and they're fat soluble vitamins. So looking at these nutrients, especially, like a lot of people remember vitamin D is important for male and female fertility and immune balance, but retinol often gets neglected and that's unfortunate. A
It's
lot of
like
the
one of
time,
the main immune balancers,
oh
vitamin
yeah,
A.
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's important, I think, too, that you're saying this is the male and the female partner, if
Yeah.
possible, to get
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
right, not just the female.
Sure. Yeah. A lot of the time I like to look at zinc. Zinc is really important both for sperm and egg health. And it is, so when the sperm and egg unite, they've looked at this under powerful microscopes, there is this flash of light that happens. And that is actually caused by zinc. If you don't have enough zinc, that spark it's called the zinc spark. And the zinc spark will not occur if you don't have enough zinc. And that's,
We can
so
put the video in the show notes
That's
here so
so
people can
cool.
see it. Yeah.
it is.
It's
It's really
like,
cool.
Can I also ask for listeners, when you're talking about the importance of vitamin A as retinol, is beta carotene sufficient? Because I know a lot of people, like if you were to Google vitamin A sources, usually you see beta carotene
Mhm.
sources, and that's what people hear. And so they're like, oh, I'm getting enough of that. But
Mhm.
say that's not exactly the same, correct? The way it
Right.
functions for a
Yeah.
lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out, Hannah. Beta carotene is a precursor to vitamin A. It's wonderful, and we should all be eating foods that contain beta carotene. And I would argue also foods that contain preformed vitamin A. There are many factors, including epigenetic factors, that can determine a person's ability to convert beta carotene to actual active vitamin A, retinol. And so, in prenatal vitamins, it is only the preformed vitamin A that has the potential to be teratogenic. So it's like too much of a good thing
Yeah.
is not always good. Beta
Also, my
carotene,
liver is a concern.
yeah, for sure. Polar bear liver is the worst, actually. So most people are not really getting that. But
People in Alaska, be aware of that. Okay, so wait,
yeah,
but
for
go
sure.
back and explain to people like break that down to like talk to us like we're 6-year-olds, because what you said is really important, but it was very technical.
So preformed vitamin A is the active form. So what our body needs is the endpoint. It's almost like, okay, here are the ingredients that I'm going to use to make my muffins versus like my actual muffins. There are some people who are not very good cooks and will not be able to convert those ingredients into edible muffins. And other people who are really good cooks and will be able to make delicious muffins that will maybe even look very nice. So that is the metaphor that I'm using as a conversion.
It's a good one.
So your beta carotene is those ingredients, and your ability to convert that, it's not a reflection of your cooking ability or your moral value or even how well you eat. It can be just, a genetic hit and miss. So if your body is efficient at converting beta carotene to active vitamin A, that's wonderful and you're lucky. If your body is not, then it's going to be important for you to get preformed vitamin A. So some people who have a diet that is rich in beta carotene will not have sufficient levels of retinol. And those are people who are not converting well. Now, I think more women than men are good at converting beta carotene to vitamin A, but that does not guarantee that you're going to be one of the lucky ones. There are a lot of
And
things.
when you say beta carotene, that's the form of vitamin A that's found like in sweet potatoes and carrots. And
And
like Hannah,
plant
you're saying,
foods
if you Google it, but then like the active form retinol is found in
and
like egg
animal foods.
yolks, liver,
Yeah.
meat. It's an animal food source.
Yeah.
And
Cod liver
so
oil.
cod liver oil, totally. And then you also said, Sarah, I don't think I could pronounce this word, teratogenic. Is that
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Did it. Okay. So that means basically it can lead to congenital disabilities,
Yeah.
right?
It can
And
lead to
that
birth
can
defects.
only happen from what form of vitamin A?
The preformed, the active form. So
The
Which is
active
retinol.
form,
yeah.
retinol,
Retinol
right?
and preformed are synonymous, I guess.
So you just want to have a balanced amount of those animal foods
For
in your
sure.
diet and not overdo it.
Yeah. Yeah. I generally don't suggest that people take cod liver oil, for example, during pregnancy or eat cod livers during pregnancy, because that is an easy way to sort of overdose on preformed vitamin A. Also, eating liver all the time is potentially risky. So you want to get a balance of different plant and animal foods. The greater the diversity of your diet, the more you change things up, the more different micronutrients you're going to get, the more you're going to feed bacterial diversity. And by the way, that does really help with hormonal balance and all
Right.
kinds of things that are good for male and female fertility. And that it just helps sort of have immune balance, obviously, right? And so the more diverse your diet is, the less likely you are to have deficiencies and imbalances in pretty much any body system, and fertility and pregnancy are no exception to that by any means.
So preconception, I'm just kind of like giving a synopsis. CBC with differentials, probably a CMP also, a comprehensive metabolic panel. You want to see a full thyroid panel, especially if a woman has had trouble conceiving or maintaining a pregnancy. And then would you
Yeah,
say, go ahead.
I would say also hemoglobin A1C. In certain cases, certainly if somebody presents as having PCOS or even males with metabolic dysfunction, we definitely want to pay attention to C-peptide, to the big picture of how their blood sugar regulation is functioning. People who exhibit high levels of oxidative stress, we definitely want to look at their also, if somebody comes to me and they have a history of bipolar disorder, male or female, I also want to look at their uric acid levels because they tend to be higher in people, particularly during manic or hypomanic phases, that the uric acid levels tend to go higher than.
Yeah, people think of uric acid as a kidney marker, and like biologically, we can look at it as a marker of oxidative stress.
For sure. Yeah. Sometimes I like to see zinc and copper or zinc. Zinc is really, we talked about zinc a little bit ago. Zinc is really important, not just for sperm and egg health and for that, for the conjunction of the sperm and egg during fertilization, but it also is important in testosterone. Sometimes, depending on what the food journal looks like, we might want to look at other micronutrients. Sometimes it can be helpful to look maybe at at a fatty acids panel, depending on the situation. Lipid panels in certain situations maybe could be revealing. There's so many different things that could be useful in certain situations.
Yeah, totally. Like you're basically taking the person and really specifying tests based on what you see in the clinical picture. I think it's probably just an important takeaway for people that if you are trying to conceive, if there is any issue, or if you just really want to be thorough, like definitely pay attention to these specifics that Sarah is talking about. But at the very least, get a CMP, CBC with differentials, full thyroid panel, vitamin D. Really hear you. Hemoglobin A1C it's basically a marker of kind of like a 3-month overview of your ability to metabolize glucose. And then I would say a full iron panel, right?
Oh
Like you
yeah,
want to
for sure.
see
Yes.
iron and
Yeah.
ferritin.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
I almost wonder, Sarah, like, is there anywhere where you have kind of like a basic guide for people that they could download?
I don't know if y'all are aware of this, but I've also seen recently an influencing culture similar to the not needing to take a prenatal whole thing, not needing to supplement with vitamin D
Ah,
for adults or infants, and saying that, I don't know, there's all these different like
yeah,
thoughts about it. It's
for
very
sure.
interesting to me because when you look at the actual research and on it, like it's so clear the correlation between health outcomes and vitamin D status.
Hmm.
To hear someone say like, no, you don't need to take a supplement is wild to me. But I would
Yeah.
love to hear your thoughts on that, Sarah, if we have time for that.
Yeah, we can address that now. I think it is very bio individual. I have an aversion to even recommending a multi or a prenatal multivitamin to somebody without looking at their vitamin D status first. It is an incredibly important marker that we want to see. I'm sorry, I also B12 and folate, and I also
Oh
like to
yeah.
see vitamin B
Mm.
in preconception. That helps me um, suggest a prenatal multi and also fine tune people's nutrition. But to go back to vitamin D, we can't assume even based on a person's stat nutrition, what they're eating, whether they're vegan, how much they're outside in the sun, whether or not they use sunscreen. We can't assume anything about their vitamin D status based on that information. We have to be able to see the actual lab results. Because vitamin D is an immunomodulator, it's also it's very sort of multifunctional. It can prevent all kinds of issues from, blood sugar dysregulation problems to
Yes.
autoimmune diseases to postpartum depression. So I think it would be fair to say it's pleiotropic, and it supports male and female health. And in the bigger picture, it's obviously not the only thing you would want to look at, but it is incredibly important. Sometimes people's vitamin D levels will be too high, and you wouldn't want to. So, looking at large population studies, most women during pregnancy will benefit from 4,000 IUs a day of vitamin D supplementation, but that might be too much for some people, and it might even not be enough for some other people. So it is, yes, you can assume that on large numbers that giving maybe at least 2,000 IUs a day is going to not be too much, and it also isn't going to put people at an extreme deficit. But if you can test people and dose their vitamin D supplementation accordingly, it's really helpful. And it's also really important for the prenatal multi to include vitamin K2 in sufficient amounts to help that vitamin D do its work in the body. It helps transport calcium kind of where it needs to go in the body so that,
Yeah, they work really closely together.
yeah, they do.
Yeah, I'm just thinking like, okay, like we've probably been talking for about an hour, and like the juiciest part of this podcast, or like your work, like what we want to communicate in this podcast, we haven't really hit on yet. Do we just want to maybe touch on that like for pregnancy and then record a part 2 later and talk more about pregnancy and preconception?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah. So here's like the big reveal. I mean, we talked about it a little bit in the beginning, but essentially, there is a very different way of interpreting blood test results when a woman is pregnant and in the postpartum period versus when somebody is not pregnant. Like, it's so different when we were researching this. I mean, Sarah, I think sometimes I would just email you and be like, you're not even a human anymore. Like you turn into this completely different creature. And to their credit, and I'm sure you've seen this, maybe both of you in practice, there are really wonderful OBGYNs who are very aware of this. Like it's in that field, but it has not translated into the field of integrative and functional medicine, even though there has been this extreme focus in our world of interpreting blood tests in the most accurate way possible, right? We're like rabid about, like ranges that are optimal versus, just, keeping people alive and like that. But in the meantime, there's this like entire population of people this time of life where their blood tests are not being interpreted correctly. And so Sarah is one of the only people that I'm aware of. I think there's like 3 people out there maybe that are like speaking to this publicly, and you're one of them. So do you want to dive into pregnancy blood tests?
Yeah, absolutely. I really also do want to say that the research that we did, I didn't do this all by myself. So Victoria, as you alluded, you were part of the research, and also Marianne Marks, who owns a bloodwork software program, which is terrific. And it is the only bloodwork software interpretation program that I'm aware of that adjusts reference ranges for pregnancy by trimester. And it does a lot of other neat things too.
It's a cool software. Like it is so freaking
so
cool.
good. But, it's part of the story of how this work evolved beyond this initial stage where people were coming to me in pregnancy with lab work that was just flagged in ways that didn't make sense for the clinical picture. And I was just researching on a case by case and marker by marker basis, which was exhausting, by the way. Then what happened was that you, Victoria, introduced me to Marianne, and we knew that there was going to be something that would happen out of that, like a zinc spark, right? but
we were
but we didn't know
something.
what. But so we had this conversation about blood markers, and I said, Marianne, it would be so amazing if your lab work software could reflect how blood work changes during pregnancy, so it wouldn't be so exhausting to interpret stuff. Because I was using her software and I loved it, but I said it doesn't apply to pregnancy. So we teamed up together, and the 3 of us, Marianne, Victoria, and I, did collective research, and we were meeting every week to talk about it.
I bet we read 1,000 papers.
We read so many papers. We read so many papers, and I had identified maybe a few dozen markers that changed based on the blood work that I had seen. But in the process of researching, we identified over 100 markers that changed during pregnancy.
I think that we should like start the podcast here and then like splice in the rest of it, because when you say that to people, it's like, especially a clinician, like somebody who's like a functional medicine practitioner, a functional doctor, that there are over 100 markers that are different in pregnancy by trimester, like you said. That is mind-blowing.
It is. Yeah.
It is so different than what you're taught in any other functional blood chemistry analysis program. And I've taken plenty. Like nobody is looking at this. And in the meantime, all these pregnant women are like, hey, everything's out of range.
Yeah.
What's going on?
For sure. Even, I just had a client that I worked with a couple of years ago write me out of the blue. Last week, she had gotten her second trimester CBC results back. I hadn't heard from her, after we stopped working together, because she had met her goals and she just went off into the sunset, which is great. But then she came to me with this lab report, and she said, hey, Sarah, I think something's wrong with me. I mean, I feel fine, but look, my CBC came back and pretty much everything is off. And I was like, let me take a look at that for you. Her OBGYN didn't even tell her that it was all normal. I mean, everything was fine. It was perfect. It was great. And I can't wait to meet with her next week to talk to her about, how everything is just perfectly fine. I did email her and say, hey, it all looks really normal for the second trimester pregnancy. Yeah.
Sarah, do you feel comfortable going through just kind of like some of the most like familiar tests that people would, they would be like, oh yeah, I've heard of that, or like I've seen that on my blood test, that are different in pregnancy?
Yeah. First and foremost, white blood cells, especially neutrophils, because those
that's your dominant white blood cell. You have like 60% or something ish neutrophils usually.
And that percentage goes up during pregnancy because neutrophils are really important for placental function. So it just looks extraordinarily different. If we looked at, a normal white blood, complete blood count for a pregnant person, would, by the time they hit the second and third trimester, if in a non-pregnant person, it would look like, a significant bacterial infection is happening, but it's not.
Yeah, totally normal
Wow.
in pregnancy. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, kidney markers, GFR, the
Yeah, it's
glomerular
hard. Did you have like an
filtration
Italian accent
rate.
anyway? And then it's such a weird word.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It goes way up because kidneys just have to work harder because there's just so much more to filter. And then there's this, the blood sugar levels go down. So what would look like a perfectly normal fasting blood sugar read during non-pregnancy is actually potentially a little too high or even significantly high during pregnancy. And a lot of end users don't really understand that, although OBGYNs absolutely do.
They know that about glucose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
So is that
sometimes
reflected on, sorry.
sometimes people will go to their doctor and get lab work during pregnancy, and they'll think their doctor is wrong because their doctor is telling them, look, your blood sugar is it's a little too high. I want you to track, with a blood sugar monitor. I want you to, get this additional testing done. And they're like, but it's completely normal. And I'm like, no, it's not, because the ranges change in pregnancy.
Whoa. So if you do the postprandial glucose test, what's it called? The glucose test that you have to do for gestational diabetes.
Oral glucose tolerance test.
Yes. Thank you. So the range on that is different.
Range. Yeah.
It's a pregnancy range.
Yeah.
That's okay. That is really fascinating. I don't know if anyone has ever explained that to me. Like you don't hear that talked about, that it's different versus non-pregnant. So just mind blown over here.
Hannah, there was like a year where I was like, I can't think about anything else. It's like there has never been a person who doesn't have kids that has thought about pregnancy as much as
I'm sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Because there's so many examples like that. Like Sarah, I feel like I remember when we were researching, don't the kidneys grow by like
20%?
They don't double. It's like by half. It's like a kidney and a half. Your kidneys get so much bigger when you're pregnant.
They get
the anatomy changes.
Yes.
Like obviously the anatomy changes when you're pregnant, but like your organs grow.
The thyroid does too, a little bit. It shouldn't be visibly enlarged. If it's visibly enlarged, it's something that you can notice that in the mirror, or somebody will notice that is a problem and you need to get an ultrasound and a workup done. But it does grow a little bit imperceptibly during pregnancy. And TSH goes down in the first trimester. So thyroid ranges are completely different in pregnancy. Usually when you get a lab report for TSH, you will see that trimester 1, trimester 2, trimester 3, and then babies and children. So that is something that even the traditional lab companies are reporting.
But I've never seen it like on a functional lab kind of like cheat sheet.
They don't. Yeah.
It's wild to me. Like, how did this not get into our world?
Yeah. It's amazing. It really is mind-boggling. Yeah. Yeah. That and pediatrics.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think about thyroid specifically, there are so many people who turn to functional medicine or, some type of integrative medicine from conventional because they have a thyroid pathology. It's one thing that we're pretty good at in the functional world. We can ferret out these thyroid pathologies. And then when they do get pregnant, the ranges need to be interpreted not only for pregnancy ranges, but also with that pathology in mind. It's like supremely important, it seems like, in that organ system to be aware of this.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Sorry, Sarah, we keep interrupting you. This is just so exciting. So glucose, thyroid changes in pregnancy. What are kind of some other like big ones that change?
Yeah, a lot of the liver markers like alkaline phosphatase changes. It gets pretty high towards the end of pregnancy. And that's not because you actually have anything wrong with your liver. It's just partly because there are different isoenzymes of, am I saying that right? Alkaline phosphatase. There's a placental isoenzyme and a bone isoenzyme. So this affects both pregnancy and postpartum levels because of the activity, first of all, during pregnancy of the placenta, and then during postpartum, if you're lactating, alkaline phosphatase can stay significantly elevated over non-pregnant ranges for 18 months after birth. And that is probably because of the bone isoenzyme being affected by the amount of calcium that is required for breastfeeding.
Yeah, for lactation.
Whoa. So what if someone is doing a longer term breastfeeding or nursing, I guess, at that point? So Like, for instance, I nursed my son until he was 3. So that
Yeah.
would be 3 years postpartum. So if I had had my blood work done at year 2 postpartum or two
It
and a
would
half, would it still be all wacky or would it have
probably
normal?
not. So alkaline phosphatase appears to, there hasn't been a lot published on it, but from the studies that have been published, it appears to return to normal baseline non-pregnancy levels by 18 months postpartum, probably because the child is not relying so much. I think if
Right.
you were still exclusively breastfeeding, then yes, you would still be, requiring a lot of calcium, I suppose. But it would be very unusual to be exclusively breastfeeding at that point.
Yeah.
Right.
So you're just producing less, breast milk, and that's causing less impact on your physiology at that
Right.
point.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
Fascinating.
Sarah, I remember iron. I mean, iron is kind of this like very complex, highly controversial in the holistic world
Yeah.
topic. And then when you bring it into
Mhm.
pregnancy, like I remember I'm going to name him. Okay, I'm going to name a name. We did all this research because we would get all these questions about the work of Morley Robbins,
Yeah.
who essentially, if I think I'm right on this, he says like never supplement iron,
Or
if you
vitamin
have,
D.
yeah, or
Yeah.
vitamin D.
Maybe that's where the vitamin D influencer
Yeah.
thing is coming
Yeah.
from.
Yeah. I think
And
he
Yeah.
he's like
started it.
extremely popular. And when he speaks, he has this like, he's like pretty sharp and he can like
Yeah.
speak really well. It's like one of those instances where it's like somebody like the words just roll off their tongue and they kind of sound like
Mhm.
they know what they're talking about. But then, I mean, females, I would say, pregnancy specifically, but humans generally, overarchingly, when you look into iron physiology, what we know is very different than what he teaches, even
Absolutely.
though it sounds very good.
Yeah.
And personally, I have not seen, I don't know, does he see clients or does he see
Yeah.
patients? What is like, where is he getting this information from is still confusing to me. But yeah, do you just want to talk about iron
Yeah.
for, I don't know how long, like 4 hours? You could probably talk about iron.
Well, I hope not. But so, yeah, I mean, on the one hand, pregnancy does require a lot of iron. The first trimester, not so much, actually. So, what happens is that a lot of women, actually healthy women, have a higher need for iron intake from diet and or supplementation while they're menstruating than in the first trimester of pregnancy. So, if you go into the first trimester of pregnancy, iron sufficient, and it is very important. So, thank you, Victoria, for asking about iron as a good lab panel to look at before conception. That is really important. We want to make sure that a woman is not iron deficient or insufficient before she conceives. We don't want you to go into pregnancy in an iron deficient state. If a woman goes into pregnancy in an iron sufficient state and has a normal first trimester, so she doesn't have hyperemesis gravidarum, she's not losing nutrients to vomiting consistently and whatnot, then it's very unusual for her to have an additional need for iron, and her need for iron might actually go down compared to when she was
Wow.
menstruating. Now, once you hit the second trimester, the developing fetus is using and the placenta are using more nutrients, and that includes a fairly significant demand for extra iron. So on the one hand, we want to make sure that we're not missing those people who actually need to supplement with iron. And based on the research that we looked at for iron homeostasis in pregnancy, for those people who need that iron supplementation, it is actually more efficient for absorption to provide iron supplementation every other day instead of daily, because of the way that the body will sort of put the brakes on iron absorption if you're providing it daily.
Right.
But if you're using non-pregnancy reference ranges to look at iron markers, including ferritin, you will overdiagnose iron insufficiency, and you could overload a person with more iron than they need. So
Wow.
if you are supplementing every single woman with additional iron that is not necessary, that is associated with negative outcomes. So
Mhm.
people who do not need that extra iron or all that extra iron that they might be supplemented by a practitioner who is diligently interpreting lab work, but not in a way that is pregnancy appropriate by the trimester, then the woman could be supplemented with more iron, and that could cause oxidative stress, and that can actually increase the risk of gestational diabetes and problems also with, I think, and this might seem a little bit contradictory to the gestational diabetes risk that is increased, but I think also small for gestational size.
I think so. I remember reading that in a study.
Yeah.
Sarah,
So,
you know where this is like if people have questions or want to look at this, I think Marianne might still have a blog on the Lab Smarts website
oh
that breaks
yeah,
down like the iron physiology research that we did. I mean, it was like,
yeah,
I was like, I never need to read about iron ever
yeah.
again. But we wrote all of that up into blogs.
That's
It's
true.
on
Yeah,
labsmarts.com
yeah,
if people
yeah,
want to read about this more.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, I mean, I don't want to really belabor the iron piece beyond that, except to say that, excess iron can cause immune stress and oxidative stress. So if you were to have a bacterial infection during pregnancy and you were to take excess
Awesome.
iron compared to what you needed, then that could feed the bacterial infection and that could cause some additional problems.
But it's interesting because like you kind of have to know what the pregnancy ranges are because it looks like infection at
Yeah.
some point in
Oh yeah.
pregnancy, even though it's not infection.
Yeah.
So it's like there really is
Absolutely. Yes.
like there's some like subtlety there.
For sure, there's a lot of subtlety, and it is really important to be aware of those actual proper pregnancy trimester specific reference ranges, because if you even miss one of them, like you understand the iron piece, but you don't understand the white blood and neutrophil piece, you could make some inappropriate clinical decisions.
Yeah.
And this does happen. I've had very experienced clinicians come to me for consultation on cases for pregnancy where, for example, total protein goes down in pregnancy. And there was this clinician who took our course who brought a case study to us of a client that he had been working with. This was at the beginning of the course. And on the basis of her low, quote unquote, low protein levels, he had supplemented her with a combination amino acid supplement, and it had shot her liver enzymes way up, way beyond what is conceivable as normal, even for pregnancy ranges. So even, it was mainly her AST and ALT, which went really high, whereas the liver enzyme that we would typically see going up is alkaline phosphatase. So, I explained to him that her total protein was actually appropriate for her stage of pregnancy,
Right.
and suggested that he pull out that supplement, and he did, and she had that blood work repeated, and it was totally normal. So what would have been
Wow.
looked at as a liver pathology was actually a practitioner error caused by a misinterpretation and just not understanding that. I would feel very uncomfortable about supplementing with, amino acids can just do so many things. So if you're getting protein in a whole food form, that's really important. But if you're providing separate amino acids, like it can do things that maybe even the research doesn't know yet what all they are.
So when
Yeah,
you
that's
say
like
separate amino acids, would that be the equivalent of like a whey protein powder,
No, it
or
wasn't. No,
something
that
different,
is more like, yeah,
like a
it
whole
was.
protein? It's like isolated like amino
Yeah,
acid.
yeah. It was some kind
Okay.
of like common, I don't even remember what the product was, but it was not a protein powder. No, I
Okay.
would, yeah. I mean, there probably is a place for a high quality whey protein powder supplement in pregnancy and somebody who's having digestive problems and maybe not really being able to get all the protein they need.
yeah,
Hmm.
or like morning
That's,
sickness, something like that.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
I relied on protein powder a while because I had such
Yeah.
bad morning sickness. So that
Yeah.
was
And that's totally different from an amino acid isolate supplement.
got it.
It was some kind of like, you looked at the ingredients and it was just the amino acids. It wasn't like a whole food or food based formula. It was a bit strange.
Yeah, it was
Um,
reduced. Yeah, I'm just wondering, like, would this be a good place to stop, and then we could come back and talk more? I know there are other
Sure.
pregnancy ranges, Sarah, and then about postpartum. Do you have time to come
Yeah.
back
yeah,
again?
yeah.
And
I would love that.
yeah, I guess I know, like Hannah, you have a little bit of a stop, and I have a meeting at 3:30. So
Yeah. Um, and I'm sorry, but I didn't have the spreadsheet on with the list of
oh yeah,
different labs that we recommend. So maybe we can just also redo that piece because I was kind of all over the place in answering that question.
yeah, and that's
Yeah,
okay.
that's
I mean,
fine.
it's
Yeah.
you covered a lot of them. We can just pick up with other
Mhm.
ones. That's totally
Yeah.
fine, Sarah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think the bottom line for people to walk away with is blood work interpretation is like your blood is going to look different in pregnancy and postpartum than it does when you're not pregnant or you haven't just had a baby. And that information is not well known,
For sure.
just period. And it has not translated over into kind of the sort of like accepted norms or the conversation in functional medicine. Surprisingly, I mean, I'm still like amazed. Like there's so many caveats that, for better or worse, some for better, that have translated over, and this just hasn't, even though it is so clinically applicable. Like it really affects people's lives.
For sure. Yeah.
So yeah, I think this is an important conversation. We just need a part 2, which often happens.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Anything else you're thinking before we go, Hannah?
No, I just had a thought that we should do an episode on the Morley Robbins, like whatever his program is, the RWS or RC. I can't remember the
name of his
root cause protocol.
Root cause protocol.
Yeah.
So I actually did work with a family that had consulted with him on the mineral tests of their 2 sons, and he did a horrible job. I mean, he, first of all, did not use appropriate reference ranges based on age and sex.
Right.
He interpreted their hair mineral levels as if they were adult males and that they were little children. One was 2 and one was 4.
Yeah.
And he came up with absolutely completely wrong conclusions. I had to recalculate everything based on the actual ranges. And the suggestions he gave were completely inconsistent with what was actually in the levels of the hair test. So
that's so concerning.
Yeah.
Especially as a parent, you're thinking about, like, obviously they were getting that for their kids probably for a reason. And to have it, gosh.
Yeah. So he
He's
told
very popular. There's a lot of popularity around him.
Yeah. They had excess iron, just like everybody else that Morley Robbins has ever consulted for.
No.
Yeah.
Sarah.
So, yeah. Very shocking. But yes. I would love for you all to do a GAPS episode too.
Oh, that's such a good idea. Yes. Is that on our list? Yeah, we definitely need to do that. What's your experience with GAPS, Sarah?
I became a certified GAPS practitioner. I used the last bit of my savings as soon as I graduated from NTA because I thought that I needed to. Yeah.
Yeah.
And, I used it a little bit. I actually had a really good experience with one of my first clients who was someone who had the last 12 inches of his small intestine removed because of a very bad Crohn's disease flare. I used it as a sort of like reintroduction diet and like healing diet post-surgery. But I tried applying it to other situations. It actually really messed people up. And I took histories from people who came to me because I was a certified GAPS practitioner and they tried doing GAPS on their own or with someone else. And it made them worse. And I was like, I don't want to use GAPS with you. It made you worse. Like, let's do something else.
Yeah.
It kind of turned into like one of those detox harder or like GAPS harder.
Yes. Yeah. That's very true.
It broke so many women's metabolisms, like all that fat. And a lot of my clients they have connective tissue problems. And it's a lot of histamine for some people. I mean, that is a lot of histamine for even a lot of autistic kids that will get overloaded with that much, even glutamate. So it's really heavy duty stuff.
Yeah, we should definitely
like not enough prebiotics, honestly, for most people.
I mean, none.
Similar with keto, where I wonder what it's doing to their gut balance and like how that, like some people obviously maybe because they have severe dysbiosis or bacterial overgrowth, it actually helps them feel better. But then for other people, it can just like all of a sudden do a 180 with their health and they're like going the opposite direction. And because like you said, for some people, it's incredibly powerful. Like I've known people who like have saved their kids' lives because of it. But but does everybody need to do? I don't know. It's like we should definitely do an episode on it.
Yeah, I think it would be great.
It's one of those things where it's like, there's very few topics like this, but I feel like with GAPS, I just like haven't wanted to like touch it. It felt so hot to me there at the end and around COVID and like some of the opinions that came out around COVID that I just like had to get away from it.
Yeah.
But I mean, fair enough. It is, I feel like it's still a fairly popular diet in some circles.
Yeah. I still have people come to me who, I actually worked with 2 people who are certified GAPS practitioners that came to me as clients since last summer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It's very interesting. But yeah, it didn't work for either of them, and we did completely different stuff. But
They have to gaps harder, Sarah.
yeah.
That is
Oh my
what, yeah,
gosh.
what they tell you to do.
Okay, so Sarah, we will come back with part 2. Thank you all so much for listening. Please remember to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a review. That helps other people find us. That's awesome. And if you have questions, you can email us influencetodeath@gmail.com. And Sarah, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
God, the most important thing, it's so we're going to have part 2 for sure, but the like culmination of all of this research that you did, you do have a course. So would you tell people like where to find your course and where to find you?
Sure. Yeah. So you can find me at sararusselntp.com, and Sarah without an H and Russell with 2 L's. And I will provide you with the link to the information on our course. It is actually on Marianne's. It's through Marianne's site on LabSmarts, but I don't know if it's on her front page. I don't think it is. There's a specific link with the information about the course, which is, we wrote it for practitioners, but there are some non-practitioners who might be interested in taking it, just for the like educated people who are.
Would you just say the name of the course so people can kind
Yes,
of Google
it
it and
is
check it out?
called What You Never Learned About Blood Work in Preconception, Pregnancy, and Postpartum.
Awesome. Sweet, Sarah.
Yeah.
We'll see you soon. We'll figure out another time to talk and keep talking about the markers in pregnancy that change, and then in postpartum also.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I appreciate being here. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.